Our speaker today is Norman Saul, Professor Emeritus in History, and has taught many different subjects, particularly on Russian history and Soviet history, and has written a book series devoted to sort of the history of diplomacy between Russia, the U.S., and or Soviet Union.
Not just diplomacy, all kinds of things.
Jay, I stand corrected. He's written them, I think, in sort of, well, not the order you might expect, with friends and foes, the United States and Soviet Russia, that being the period 1921 to 1941, then War and Revolution, the United States and Russia, 1914 to 1921, Russian-American Dialogue and Cultural Relations, 1776 to 1914, and then Concord and Conflict, the United States and Russia, 1867 to 1914. The subject, of course, today is World War I, relationship between the U.S., Russia, and the events of World War I. And I should tell you that next year being 1914, we have a series of events that are coming up that are devoted to commemorate the start of the war, and will continue all the way through 1917 or 2017, 2018 to commemorate the 100-year anniversary or commemoration of the war. Those will actually start off with Nathan Wood, who's going to be speaking at the Spencer Museum of Art in the spring on the start of the war, the assassination of the Archduke, and so on. And we'll give you a heads up once that's much closer to that date. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Saul.
Thank you, Barn. I apologize for not being here for the last couple of weeks. We were in Maine, where the weather was wonderful, the lobster was good, the haddock was awesome. Enjoyed it thoroughly. And now I'm back, trying to get back into gear on research projects. And this actually stems my presentation today, which is entitled The United States and Russia in the Turmoil of War and Revolution, 1914-1918, which has been submitted to this project that Bart mentioned on World War I and Russia. And I have not heard about where that stands now. But Bruce Benning, who I might hope to be here, would be able to elicit information on that. Actually, I want to talk a bit more about the graduate students mainly, on how I got involved in doing Russian-American relations. It started pretty much by accident, or, well, not totally. I was involved with Russian diplomatic history, but not with America. And I did a dissertation on that subject. And when I was teaching at a university in New England, someone came to my door, literally, and said, I have a bunch of documents. I understand that you're interested in Russian history, but this pertains to Russian history. Would you like to see them? And I said, of course. And in a week or so, they landed up at my door in cardboard boxes, papers of an American who had been to St. Petersburg and negotiated a treaty with Russia on the sale of commerce relations between California and Alaska when Russia still owned Alaska. And that turned out to be an article. But even at the same time, a colleague of mine at that university, Carl Breidenball, a well-known colonial historian, directed me toward early Russian-American commercial relations. And I found in the records of the Port of Boston clear evidence of American ships trading directly with St. Petersburg from Boston in the 1760s. And that turned out to be an article. And so I was on my way. But this was episodical. A number of other articles came along as I was ferreting out various little things that led into Russian-American relations. And I decided to try to connect these things together as a project, a big project as it turned out. And that led me eventually into World War I, starting from the beginning, the Revolutionary War and so forth. And so part of what I'm talking about today was included in this book. I thought something ought to be done in terms of World War I, Russia and America. And so here it was, several years ago, War and Revolution in the United States and Russia, 1914-1921. I will pass this around because I've tabbed a number of pictures and so forth, which I'll be talking about related to this. Subsequent to that, quite a few years later, in fact last year, I was asked to do a article, as I mentioned, for this World War I project in Russia. And so that's what I'm coming back to. So this is an example of how you can get involved in a project, from kind of getting interested in exploring, finding out things, and it's amazing what you can find out. And I know there's a lot more to be found. And I encourage anyone to think about those things. As a relative newcomer as a world power, the United States was a major influence on the outcome of the great European conflict and the peace that followed. It was called the Great War for many years, but then got relegated after World War II to World War I. But I think it really needs to be called the greatest war in history, World War I. It was the Great War, it's now the greatest war, I think. And I think a lot of evidence can produce that.
Is that as opposed to the greatest generation?
Well, I would say in answer to that, World War I lost a generation. And it might have been the greatest generation if it had survived World War I. Russia was especially a national concern to Americans because of the impact of the collapse of the Russian army and the consequent weakening of Allied pressure on the Central Powers, but also because of the rise of a new threat to the stable world as we knew it, in the form of the rise of a power of a socialist state with worldwide revolutionary ambitions. That did not happen out of World War II. In a way it did, because the Soviet Union became a great power out of that. America would become involved in this politically charged part of Europe more than any other country. The Entente allies were primarily concerned with their own destinies in surviving the conflict and winning the war on the Western Front. With American help, that effort would succeed, while another goal, saving Russia for democracy, failed. That's the opening paragraph for that. And I go into a number of pages here on linking the American-Russian links that preceded the war, which were going back to J. Alexander's work, Catherine the Great, the armed neutrality, the manifest destinies that were perceived as mutual, America going west, Russia going east, the Civil War and Russian support for the Union side, which was pretty vital. A number of other things could be tossed into this mix. The Tolstoy craze. Theodore Roosevelt, writing on one of his adventures in the West, remarked that Anna Karenina was the best book he'd ever read. And he was probably the widest read president we ever had. So he knew what he was talking about. and Tchaikovsky coming to Carnegie Hall to dedicate Carnegie Hall in conducting the New York Philharmonic in 1892. Vasily Vereshchagin giving an exhibition at the Chicago Art Institute in 1894. A number of these things. You could go on and on about these kinds of connections of Russians in America and Americans in Russia. There were a group, and Alex would appreciate this, of students at the University of Kiev who called themselves Amerikanцы because they believed that America had the right path. They were populous and came here to America to see what it was all about. To Kansas, in fact, 3 or 4 of them, and traveled around the state, spent 2 or 3 years here, and that was another thing that intrigued me and got me involved in Kansas history as well as Russian history and so on. And then there was a man named Fyodor Kaminsky, probably everyone here knows about him, but a student of mine, a former student, has written about him in a nice article, paper, given at a conference last year. He was also here, from St. Petersburg in Kansas, and he designed the frescoes on the capital of the state capital in Topeka. It's a Russian sculptor, and went on to spend a number of years in America. And he had won awards, and some of his work, I've seen them, are in the Hermitage Gallery in St. Petersburg. Stanislavski and the Moscow Art Theater, getting closer to World War I, were scheduled to visit America in 1915. This was arranged in 1914, but of course cut off by the war. But a Russian Orthodox choir did get here in 1914 and was cut off by the war and forced to stay a number of years, performing concerts and so forth throughout mostly the eastern part of America, but also the Midwest. Cultural connections were very much a part. I think Jay alluded to this in the work that I have done. It's kind of stressing all these cultural contexts, social contexts, and economic contexts, which I'll get to now. Russians were intrigued with American progress and development of shipping on and the use of canals and waterways, rivers, and Russia had some big rivers, and to imitate those, looking at the Mississippi, what we were doing there, the Erie Canal, what they could do, and transporting that into America. This becomes what Hans Roger defined as Americanism. That is, the looking by Russia to America for the future, for development, for a number of things, which helps explain, and I'm going to skip over a lot of different things, involving railroads, the building of the Moscow-St. Petersburg line done by Americans. But then, closer again to World War I, we get to the largest American companies, the largest foreign companies in Russia. Singer Sewing Machine Company with a large factory near Moscow and employing 30,000 at least employees in Russia, most of them involved in sales and repair, only about 7,000 in manufacturing. The Singer plant there, Singer Sewing Machines, became a sort of symbol of America in Russia in the early 20th century, leading into World War I. And I was in Moscow not too long ago and noticed in a restaurant, actually, the Singer sewing machine is decorated, the restroom. And of course, the symbol that everyone who's been to St. Petersburg has seen is the Singer building on Nevsky Prospect. That was their headquarters building, although the manufacturing was in Moscow. And all this, and it's a fascinating building. How many of you have been there, have seen it? Okay. If you go to St. Petersburg, I strongly recommend going to it. It's in Soviet days and in present time. It's a bookstore. It's the largest bookstore on Nevsky and in probably the city. But it's Art Nouveau. It's been recently restored. And it's a beautiful thing to see. And the cafe on the second floor, it's a great place to overlook Nevsky and the Kazansky Sobor across the street. Strongly recommend it. Get a window seat. That was the Singer building headquarters, and it's still called now, restored, as the Singer building. Unfortunately, during World War I, Kompania Singer was connotated not as American, but Jewish or German, which was a two-strike against it in World War I, and the Singer operations got pretty well ransacked throughout the country at the beginning, early in 1914. International Harvester was another big one. Again, 30,000 employees, mostly again with repair and sales operations throughout the country, but with a major manufacturing plant near Moscow in a similar suburb of Singer's, and so on. There were many others. Westinghouse was building brakes, air brakes for the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and continued operations through that period. New York Life was the largest foreign company operating in Russia at the beginning of World War I. They had almost monopolized. The only rival was Equitable in the Russian business. In banking, the largest foreign bank was New York City Bank. I love some of these names that I get into. New York Life's director was Frederick Corse. The New York City Bank was Fessenden Reserve. The J.P. Morgan Bank was McAllister Smith. If your name is Smith, you might as well get a good name to precede it. And then the mining operations, were the largest copper mine in Russia, in the Urals at Kashtin, was operated or supervised by Herbert Hoover, no less. And he was working for an international copper company that was based in London, not America, so it's multinational. And there was another big copper operation in Central Asia at Akhmeletsk, headed by Nelson Fell. There were historians at work already in Russia on all this connections of Russian and American. Samuel Harper, Frank Golder. Golder was actually there in 1914 doing research in the diplomatic archives when the war broke out. And he actually returned to America and then went back again in 1916 to continue his research. The missionary and relief operations are fascinating, and I would like to do more on that. And one of the things that I should have passed these out, because these are recent books which I have found very interesting, the ones that I've read thoroughly and reviewed. And I'm very proud of this one because of the role I may have played in it, that is encouraging a young scholar to proceed with his work on the YMCA in Russia and its operation. So it's just came out this year, and by Matthew Miller, Matt, and the American YMCA and Russian culture. So it's, again, multidimensional. I'll pass that around. And another book which I also had trouble with in first getting into it, by a man who has no connection, very little knowledge of Russian history, but decided to tackle one of the major events that took place in that period, that is the American invasion of Russia, the Siberian intervention episode, when the United States invaded Russia, Woodrow Wilson's Siberian disaster. And when I read that title, I said, oh, I can't read this, it's going to be awful. It's not bad. Turns out to be. I agree with him on what went on and how it happened and so on. Anyway, here it is. Another one. And finally, and this has only to do with the kind of introduction I was giving on the connections of Russia. And some of you have probably heard about Grand Duke Alexis and his visit to America in 1871-72. And a new book has come out called Custer, Cody, and Grand Duke Alexis, Historical Archaeology of the Royal Buffalo Hunt. Well, it is fascinating. They went out there, this team of students from the University of Nebraska, conducting 2 summers of excavations of the site of the buffalo hunt with high-powered metal detectors, all that, and it's amazing what they found. Here it is. Another book on the subject that we're talking about, but in various ways. Okay, into the World War, and I'm not going to go into all of what I found, but I mentioned the YMCA. YMCA was a major presence in Russia before World War I and during the war, especially. Its headquarters, called Mayak Lighthouse, headed by Franklin Gaylord. I love these names. And Sherwood Eddy and Malcolm Davis. And it's all recorded in the book by Miller. And it was a big center of cultural life and athletic life in St. Petersburg, Petrograd town by 1914. And the American Methodist Church, whose director was, pastor was George Simon, who was delegated there by the Methodist Board of Missionaries, and was sort of the center of the American community, which constituted probably 200, 300 people. But at the beginning of the war, it enlarged considerably during the war. And then there's a fascinating man that I would like to know more about, Eugene Hurd, H-U-R-D, who directed a field army hospital for an Army Corps on the Southwestern Front. Pull out a tab here. He described his duties in a letter to President Wilson as, quote, trying to save a few poor wounded soldiers from bleeding to death with 3 surgeons, 3 nurses, and 61 soldiers under me, working some days 23 out of 24 hours. And he did this for months on the southwestern front in Russia. Philip Newton, another one, devoted much of his life heading a American Red Cross unit in Russia, also on the front lines. And although his circumstances in Kiev led him to withdraw in 1915, he returned in 1916 with 20 ambulances to serve the front cause there. Amazing some of the sacrifices that were made there. In Petrograd, the American community organized what was called the American Hospital, which served at least 20 or more wounded soldiers. And they've been able, some recent research has been able to uncover the names of these soldiers and their testimonies as to their experiences. at that hospital. Then there was also the American Refuge. 27 women and 20 children were cared for. This was for widows and children of victims of the war in Petrograd. The largest American presence, however, served another cause, a new presence, and that was what was called the Second Division of the American Embassy in Petrograd. American Embassy was located in Verstadskia ulica, not too far from the State Duma, and where a lot of the activity was taking place in 1917. Headquarters of the Bolsheviks, etc., was not far away. But they also, because they had, under the Geneva Convention, had taken over supervision of the operation of the state-owned entities of Germany and Austria-Hungary. German embassy was no problem. The Russians had ransacked it. Literally, it was no use. Nothing to be done about it. The Austria-Hungary embassy survived intact. It was taken over by the Americans, and they took the overflow of the business into the Austro-Hungarian embassy, which was pretty close, right next to the Duma, practically. The Second Division, so-called, was to supervise under the Geneva Convention, the prisoners of war taken by the Russians. Quite a few Germans, but mostly Austro-Hungarian. And many of those were defectors, deserters from the army. Slavic, Serbian, mostly Czechoslovak, in that operation. And they served. The camps were scattered all over Russia, the prisoner of war camps. There were 300 of these, and they had some problems at the beginning because one of the criteria of the Americans employed was they had to know German to communicate. Well, what does an American speaking German mean to the Russians? Spies. Well, they got rid of that pretty quick because they were very efficient in what they were doing, conscious that they took over Russian responsibility in many cases for the prisoners of war, ensuring that they got food, that they got health and medicine. Much of this supplied by Germany through Sweden and so forth. Care packages, food packages, American distribution system took care of that. The Second Division, and somebody should write a book about that. I've seen it. I've been in the National Archives, and there's a huge one. You know how Americans are. They have to report on everything. And so there's a huge volume of material on the inspection of prisoner of war camps in far-flung places in Siberia with elaborate maps and everything to go with it. And it's fascinating reading. And I get into some of that in the book, in this article, but it's worth more attention, certainly. And they also helped organize the beginnings of the Czechoslovak Legion, realizing that many of those Slavs under Russian custody were ready to fight on the other side. And so they really did a big role in getting that thing started, which would lead to the Czechoslovak Legion and all that happened in Siberia. There was also a new diplomatic contingent that came into Russia because they needed more personnel on the spot. And this is another interesting story that I would like to see more done on, because Wilson was influenced by Colonel House, who had close connections with the Ivy League. And so most of the new personnel were draftees out of the Ivy League. Yale and Harvard mainly. And they're interesting people, again, with interesting names. Chapman Huntington of Chicago, Basil Miles of New York, Norman Armour of Boston, Sheldon Whitehouse, who came off a yacht off Cape Cod to to go to Russia. And then there were the journalists who flowed into Russia, because this is where we can find a story. And it was a fascinating story. Americans were intrigued by particularly two things that happened in Russia. One was that Americans, with a lot of publicity, had struggled with the idea of prohibition, alcohol. You know all the story about that, I think. The Anti-Saloon League and all that. Well, Russia, in August 1914, declared prohibition. That was it. We've done it. Americans still continue to struggle with accomplishing prohibition. So that raised a lot of flags in America. How could Russia do this and we can't? And so that was one. Another thing was that attracted American interest was that the Russians decided in 1917 that we should put women in combat. Well, there was a lot of women's rights going on in America and elsewhere. Had Americans gone that far? No. But Russia was going that far, and that attracted a lot of publicity in 1917 in America and so on. And I'm getting into the story of the journalists who covered the Russian scene, and it was really well covered, and well covered, I would say. And Stanley Washburn, even John Reed in his early work on Russia, 1916 visit, Louise Bryant, Betsy Baby, Donald Thompson. And more work needs to be done on Donald Thompson. If you've seen any first-hand newsreels of Russia in 1917, in any kind of documentary presentation, not one that was reenacted later, like in Red October, one of those things, but it's Donald Thompson's work. He produced a documentary film on 1917, a 90-minute film that was premiered in his hometown, Topeka, Kansas, in 1918. And it's not to be found anywhere. That is the complete 90-minute. I've searched and searched. It doesn't exist. The fragments of it do. Pieces of it still are around. But so his work was, I think, another thing to be investigated. And there's some work that's been done on that. Not all of this is totally out of the blue. Now, getting into the war proper, I want to allow time for discussion and comments and so on. There were a number of missions that were going back and forth between Russia and America. The Russians, I think, sought opportunities to escape the conditions and situation they were involved in. And if anyone offered a mission to America, hands went up all over the place. And there were a number of missions that went on. There was the Sapochnikov mission. This is almost hilarious in its war supply became a big issue, of course, as the war went on and on. By 1916, where Russia was running out of supplies and not able to produce them themselves because they had relied a lot from outside imports. Petrograd was practically paralyzed because of the shortage of coal, and it was the largest industrial center in Russia. at the time. The coal had been imported from Great Britain. So where are you going to get coal now? From Ukraine, possibly, if you can bring it up. It's a long way, long haul, going through a transport system that's mainly supplying the front, east-west. So industry is declining. Plants are not producing so much. Although I must add, interject, that American plants like Singer, International Harvester, Westinghouse did produce for the war effort. They switched to their ordinary produce, like sewing machines. And then I had another interjection. Almost all of the uniforms in the whole war on all sides were sewed together by Singer sewing machines. But they were heavy duty ones. Russia didn't have those. They had to import the heavy duty machines to sew their uniforms, but it was a big operation. The beginning of the war, the Russians were on a big disadvantage because the war supply system was controlled by a supply mission, a supply council, Central Purchasing Committee is what it was called, based in London, that ruled, number one, Western Front. That's it. So I think secondary, way down the list, comes the Eastern Front. And that, I think, may have produced the Russian Revolution, the conditions in 1917 that led to the revolutionary turmoil and the shortage of supplies, all the rest went with it. But the Russians themselves bungled a number of credible initiatives. They contracted with White Motor Company, the largest American producer of heavy-duty trucks, for 800 trucks. But because of failure to proceed with details and money transfers, the order was canceled. In a similar case, an early one for 1 million pairs of knee-high boots from Rice and Hutchins, the largest American manufacturer of boots, for $5 million, was canceled because Russia arrested the company's agents on suspicion of being spies. You know, they're shooting themselves in the foot, literally, with boots. The consul general in Moscow, that's another major office of the Americans, was the consul general in Moscow. In Moscow commented, "This is the most shameful, unspeakable offense against citizens of a friendly country I have experienced during my 6 years in Russia." Russia had a way of shooting themselves in the foot without the protection of an American boot. Another contract for 50,000 badly needed freight cars with the Pullman Company in Chicago fell through because of Russian insistence of paying for them in rubles and having them assembled in Russia. Well, it goes on. The problems with supplies. They did finally gain a contract for much needed rifles. Now the Russians had an American rifle to begin with, well, sort of. It was the Berdanka, Hiram Berdan, soon after the Civil War, designed a rifle for the Russian infantry. It was still in use at the beginning of World War I. It was obviously outdated, although it had been improved over the years somewhat. Noted particularly in contrast to other weapons as having the bayonet permanently fixed, welded on to the rifle so that you couldn't take it off. Although Russian soldiers often did, breaking it off somehow because it was a nuisance. And then they were left without a bayonet. Well, they used the bayonet to open cans and so on. But anyway, they finally, American rifle companies, Springfield, Remington, and so forth, were loaded down with all they could produce for the Western Front, for Britain and France and so on. And then for America when we got into the war. And so, and this is perhaps the greatest fiasco pertaining to this need for Russia under arms. Not being able to contract with reputable rifle manufacturers, they did go and finally convince, and the American government's pressure involved, Westinghouse would produce them. Westinghouse had never made rifles, but they were known, Westinghouse was known as a company, a good company in America, so why not get them to make rifles? Well, think what this is going to entail. Getting geared up to make rifles on Russian specifications, because they had to be the same caliber and everything as the ones that were in use on the Eastern Front. Did these rifles ever get to Russia? Yes. They were in use, equipped by the American Intervention Force in North Russia on the grounds that there might be of some use with the caliber contributions. The American soldiers hated them. In other words, they came to England in time to equip the American forces that were going into the intervention in August 1918. And they were equipped with these Westinghouse rifles. The World War I Museum has one, they told me, in their basement. But they don't want to display it because it's ridiculous, they thought. But they got this permanent bayonet attached. You can imagine what American soldiers thought about that, marching up and down with these bayonets, turning around and back. Anyway, this is some of the problem, war material. It finally began to get to Russia, a lot of it, into Murmansk and Arkhangelsk and Vladivostok. The big problem, of course, was getting access into Russia for these supplies, and it was building up. But the railroad system was in such bad shape to get them out of those ports and into Russia front was, well, at that time, Russia's out of the war. The revolution has occurred. A major change does take place as America enters the war. And America enters the war in part because of the Russian Revolution. How could America enter the war to make Russia safe for democracy with Nicholas II as a major ally? It didn't fit. But, fortunately, the February-March Revolution came along and Russia was a different country, so it appeared. And so now we could enter the war. And in fact, I've got documentation that shows that Wilson was very much influenced by the February Revolution and the opportunity to really exercise a role in saving Russia for democracy. And that was what was going on. I'm going to conclude here with a couple of quotations from this article. And this section is entitled, Losing Russia. Was it possible for the United States to save Russia from what followed? A brutal civil war, disastrous famine, and a communist dictatorship? I say, probably not, considering the American capitulation to the British and French assistance on the concentration of military and other support on the Western Front. Nonetheless, the failure to save Russia for democracy was the crucial failure of the Wilsonian internationalism, which led to non-recognition of the new Soviet government, a frustrated retreat into isolationism, and the resignation from America's deserved position as the leader of the post-World War I world. I'll open it up for questions, discussion.